You're listening to the Daily Debate on the Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing Britain's place in or out of Europe. Last Sunday, the Observer newspaper published the results of a poll of 5,000 Europeans in 4 different countries: the UK, Germany, France and Poland. It showed Britons are far more hostile to the EU and its policies than people from the other 3 nations. Just 26% of voters here see the EU as a good thing, compared with 42% who see it as a negative thing. And our European partners seemingly have little interest in keeping us in the Union. Just 9% of German and 15% of French people surveyed think Britain is a positive influence in the Union, though the number was higher for Poles, of whom 33% think the UK is a positive influence. The polling comes as senior political figures like Malcolm Rifkind and Nick Clegg say there's an urgent need to fight back against spiralling anti-EU sentiment. But they may have a tough fight on their hands. Polling this weekend shows that support for the vehemently anti-Europe UK Independence Party now stands at 19%, more than double that of the Liberal Democrats. I'm joined now to discuss the significance of these latest figures by David Coburn, UKIP's London chairman, Richard Lamming, Vice Chair of the European Movement UK, a pro-European Union campaign group, and by Keith Boyfield, an economist and a research fellow at the think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies. If I might start with you, Richard, these are depressing figures for you, I would have thought.
These figures are consistent with what we've seen for a long time, which is in the face of a lot of bad news, some of it justified, but quite a lot of it, I have to say, not justified. People are getting disillusioned with the European Union. We can see that every day in lots of ways. It's much why it's important for those of us who understand that the European Union is a good thing and Britain's membership of it is a good thing, that we get organised to put the case, to explain the benefits to our daily lives from the fact that Britain's a member of the European Union and why we benefit from it so much and how much more we could get if we put even more into contributed even more to the European Union.
So what would you like Britain to contribute more of?
In lots of ways, encouraging free and open markets, for example. There's a great deal more the European Union could do to improve the markets in food and drink, for example, or in energy. There's a great deal of things that could be done there, which we British people would benefit from, people across the rest of Europe would benefit from. If the British government champions this, we can find allies and we can promote these things across the whole of Europe for benefit of everyone.
David, of course, you must be very pleased by these figures. They do rather back up what you've been saying all along. Most Britons don't want to be in the EU.
Absolutely, and the more Mr. Salmond in Scotland keeps on about Scotland going into the European Union if it became independent, the more the Scots are disillusioned by the whole idea of it. I'm afraid that the vast majority of people in this country just simply are not interested in the European Union. They see it as an enormous money pit. It's undemocratic. The books haven't been audited for years. It's seen as thoroughly corrupt and seen as a retirement home for corrupt European statesmen or prime ministers who have already ruined their own countries and go off to ruin the rest of the European Union as well.
On a point of information, the books have been audited. The only thing is they've not been approved.
Well,
and I think
what's
it's
the difference
13
for us
or 14
non-economists?
years since they were approved. And part of the problem is that the European Commission Audit Department is reliant upon member states to do a lot of the providing a lot of the information, and it's simply been inadequate. It's a quagmire, the European Commission, particularly the way in which they spend their regional budget. It was described by myself and a colleague at the London Business School as bribing people with their own money.
It's not a union, it's a criminal conspiracy.
Keith, you said there that it's the fault of the member nations. So do we blame the European project for things that are actually the fault of the individual nations, perhaps?
To an extent, and I think part of the problem with the European Union is that it's now made up of, I think, 28 member countries now that Croatia has become a member, and you're trying to run it as one political entity. And I think that it's an impossible task. That's one of the problems you've seen with the creation of the Eurozone. And a very respected professor of economics at Harvard, Marty Feldstein, predicted many years ago, before the euro was established, that it would actually not bring countries together, it would actually force them apart. And I'm afraid Marty's prediction is fast becoming true.
Richard, the EU's becoming a bit unwieldy and too big to actually control.
No, I don't think that's the case at all. What we find within the European Union is that we now have the world's largest single market with 500 million consumers. So British companies have access to this wide and deep market. So it's a central part of our economic prosperity. And what we see is that companies can operate across borders very freely, so their supply chains now integrate across lots of different countries. And so many British companies are intimately linked with the whole of the European economy. That's a central part of how economics works. And so that's a good thing for the British economy to be part of that system. And from the political point of view, yes, there are difficulties to overcome if we have 28 member states trying to reach common agreement on how to run things within the European Union. Yes, that's not going to shy away from that. That can be a difficult thing to do, but it's astonishing how successful that has been, establishing this common market, establishing the common rules for things like environmental protection of workers' rights, promoting equality in the workplace. There's a whole range of things that the European Union is achieved great things for, things we take for granted in everyday life.
But why couldn't
really
we do
making
that?
a positive
Why
difference
couldn't we do
to
that?
us.
Why couldn't we have our own rules on these?
If we want to have our own rules on our market, for example, we could do that. Every European country used to do that. But the effect of that is to partition the single market from 500 million consumers into many smaller markets. And so any business that wants to operate in more than one country is going to face much, much more regulation than it ever would have done. And I think this is a really important point, that the creation of the single market has abolished 28 sets of national regulations to replace with one European set of regulations.
But I think we forget.
But the European regulations are much more complicated, and they're a tremendous burden on British business. The city are very unhappy about the European Union, now want to get out of it. Most businesses, apart from very large international corporations who simply just want to move workers about and move companies about here, there and everywhere, most British businesses do not want to be part of the European Union. The burden of regulation coming from Europe more than outweighs anything that's been achieved by the single market. Most of these rules and regulations are ruining the country.
But we wouldn't go back to the rules and regulations we had in 1970 before we joined the EU. We'd have our own rules and regulations
since the GATT Accord, since the free trade agreements throughout the world, the European Union is actually redundant. It's a creature of the 1950s.
Well, I think it's certainly true that it will be pivotal when it's now the World Trade Organization, no longer GATT. They're due to meet in Bali very soon.
Very nice.
And if they can actually gain agreement on this Doha round, I think the combination of world trade rules and also the fact that you see with Switzerland and Norway, which are independent countries, not members of the European Union, they have their own bilateral relationship with the EU.
They have to rely on, they have to agree to lots of regulations of the EU, and they have no voice in altering them. Surely that's a problem. If we had to live by EU regulations, but we had no voice in altering them, then we'd have no voice.
Just think about it. The Swiss have certainly had to make some agreements, but they still have quite a lot of banking secrecy. Absolutely. And they managed to maintain quite a degree of independence. So I think my basic position with our relationship with the EU is that I'm old enough to have voted in the referendum back in the mid-70s, and I think in those days, people who were against it, Enoch Powell, Peter Shaw and so on, were thought of as rather crazy people who should be put in straitjackets. Now you're getting people like Michael Portillo, who after all is half Spanish, advocating that we should actually leave the European Union because he doesn't think that culturally we're really fit or that it's appropriate for Britain to be members of the European Union. And I would say that I'm not saying that it's probable that Britain will leave the European Union, but I certainly think it's possible, and more possible now than in the mid-1970s.
Well, quite frankly, the European Union is different from the way we do things. In England, the state is the servant of the people. In Europe, the people are the servant of the state. There's a massive cultural difference between the way the Europeans think of things and the way we think of things. I personally think that our way is better, and I think most people would do. Are also our ideas that we should not create laws just for the hell of it, and the European Union spends all its time creating laws just to give themselves a job.
But they don't always implement it. There's a league table.
Well, some do, some don't.
That is monitored by the European Commission. It's very interesting when I wrote something on this the other year. Whereas France was very keen to have directives and regulations passed, they were extremely slow at actually implementing them. One of the problems in Britain is you have something called gold plating, whereby with our legal tradition, if you pass a directive, you have to put that into law, but you can add things to it, whereas with a regulation, it has to go in just as it is. Now, with a directive, you find that a lot of city law firms are ringing up Whitehall departments saying, we'd like you to be much more specific about how this particular directive applies. And so something that might have started off as 10 pages in Brussels becomes 100 pages in Britain.
That's surely our fault rather than Europe, isn't it? You're listening to the Daily Debate on the Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing Britain's place in or out of Europe. I'm joined by David Coburn, UKIP's London chairman, Richard Lamming, Vice Chair of the European Movement UK, and by Keith Boyfield, an economist and research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Richard, can we go back to this point we were making earlier on there about how we could exist outside Europe as a free trade nation?
Keith mentioned the WTO and his hope that the Doha round will come to a conclusion soon. Well, the Doha round was launched in 1992. That's now 20 years. More than 20 years we've been hoping that the WTO will reach a conclusion. The simple answer is it won't. Unfortunately, I regret this, but it is the case that the future is not in a global trading agreement that Britain can say, oh, we're part of the WTO, therefore that's protecting us. No, it's not. The future is right now is in bilateral trade agreements between countries, the European Union with other trading partners. Now, we've mentioned Norway and Switzerland. Norway is a full part of the single market. Norway is subject to all the rules of the single market, but has no say in them. So that if you want to get out of regulation, Norway is not an option. Switzerland has a slightly different system. Switzerland has a whole host of these bilateral agreements with the European Union, and the European Union's view on these is doesn't want to negotiate any more with Switzerland. In particular, let's note that the Swiss economy is based on a high value, high productivity, high-end competition with the rest of the European Union. Companies in the European Union can compete with companies in Switzerland on that basis. The advocates of Britain leaving the European Union say, oh, we want to have less regulation. We want to be a low-wage, low-cost sweatshop economy offshore of the European Union. Now, that isn't the kind of competition that the member states of the European Union are going to be particularly interested in facilitating. So the idea that Britain could emulate the Swiss model is also, I think, nonsense.
Well, I think
if we want to have a trading relationship with the European Union with a voice in that and how that relationship should establish, which absolutely we have to have, then we have to be part of the European Union. You mentioned that David mentioned the City of London earlier. Something like 70 or 80% of the business of the City of London is transacted on behalf of clients in the rest of the European Union. If we were not in the European Union, that would be an open invitation to the rest of the EU to make it increasingly harder for its companies in their countries to do their business in the City of London. If we wanted to cut off 80% of the business of the City of London, the way to do it is to leave the European Union. I think that is madness.
David, how do you respond to the slightly larger criticism of, right, the European Union is our major trade partner, you're relying on the fact that there'll be a global free trade agreement and that we'd get access through that. Are you not being slightly naive there, saying, well, of course they'll let us have access to the markets?
No. Britain wants to do its own deals with the growing economies of Asia, China and India. We don't want to be...
We export more to Ireland than we do to these countries. I mean, it's still a tiny cohort.
What about tomorrow? Tomorrow is another day. We want to be growing, doing business with the expanding economies of Asia, not the sclerotic European, dead-in-the-water, overpriced, over-regulated, governed by... a bunch of bureaucrats who are not democratically accountable, and it's so slow to make up its mind and to do things. The European Parliament is an absolute joke. It has no power. The ministers most of them are ex-ministers who have done something appalling in their own countries.
Yes,
some of them are communists.
For a long time, this is irrelevant. For a long time in the future, the EU is going to be our major trading partner, isn't it?
Of course it will. And do you think the European Union don't want to do business with us? Because we are one of their big trading partners. There's not going to be any difference if we leave the European Union with our trade with Europe. The Europeans are just as keen to do business. They want to sell their champagne. We're one of the biggest consumers of champagne. The French will still want to sell their champagne to us. They'll still want to sell their perfume. The Germans will still want to sell their Mercedes and their BMWs and all the rest of it. So it's an absolute nonsense to suggest that. Let business go on with business. The European Union is not about business. It's a socialist, corporatist organisation that just simply doesn't like free trade and it doesn't like business.
To me, I think there's an important point to be made about the way in which Britain has dealt with its partners in the European Union over the last 10 to 20 years, particularly before the current administration. I think they're slightly better at it now. We were very poor, it struck me, at mobilising support amongst our allies, the Swedes and the Germans and so on some points. For example, the Services Directive, which was less than perfect in the way in which it was passed. And I think that what we've really got to do, and there were signs of this in the German election campaign, where Mrs. Merkel was talking, it seemed as though she was quite keen on some of the policies that were being advocated by the British, and that she would support us. I think that if we do renegotiate our relationship with the European Union, I think the onus is on Britain and our Foreign Office to try and identify and mobilise support from people across Europe. I mean, it's very interesting that we seem to get on very well with the Swedes, Finns and Poles on a number of matters, but we've not always, in these late-night negotiations in Brussels, been very good at mobilising support for certain key votes. I'd be very interested to hear what Richard's got to say about that.
Richard, are we failing to actually negotiate and getting the best that we could out of Europe?
I mean, undoubtedly we're not getting the best out of the European Union that we could at the moment. It means that it would need our politicians to be able to engage in discussions that go on in an effective manner. I mean, perhaps one of the things is that we don't have a tradition of coalition government in our country, so that in most European countries where the politicians are schooled in and trained and experienced in coalition negotiations, that's basically the kind of thing that goes on. So there's some cultural, practical reasons, but also there's a general thing that as long as our politicians are going to say, well, we're not sure about this, their ability to persuade others is going to be very limited. A wholehearted commitment to, yes, we're part of the European Union, we want to make it work, is going to get the right kind of response. The sense of actually, as we've heard from David so far this morning, you're all corrupt, you're all criminal, you're all in it for yourself. As long as that is the message that's coming from Britain, whether it's coming from the politicians or from some campaigners, that is going to make
the problem for pro-Europeans is that the politicians are driven by the opinion polls. The opinion polls say, look, most Britons don't like Europe.
Behaviour of politicians goes both ways. Yes, it follows opinion polls, but also politicians can lead.
Why do they so keen to avoid us having a referendum in this country? All the major parties will do anything, including Cameron, to avoid a referendum. All this smoke and nonsense about, there'll be a referendum if I win the next election.
He has promised a referendum if he wins the next election.
Well, he promised it before and he didn't give it to us. This is absolute nonsense. The man's not kept his word on anything. Cast iron Dave, it's just one promise broken after another. Who believes a word this man says? He's supposed to be a Conservative. Most of the Conservative Party have deserted to UKIP because they think he's not a Conservative. I mean, the man's a joke, quite frankly.
We must remember, of course, that you're a politician here, so you've got
I'm not. I'm sorry, I'm not a politician. I'm a businessman.
David, you're standing for election. That makes you a politician. Accept that fact.
But unlike Mr. Cameron and Mr. Osborne, I've actually had a proper job in my life. Those characters have never done a day's work in their life. They have no idea how real people live in the real world. UKIP is a party.
I think this is a separate
real
argument
people with real jobs, oh boy.
We've not mentioned immigration.
I was just about to come to
immigration.
We do have, and I think I'll go to Keith on this first, we do have from the 1st of January what's being seen as a major shift. Romanians and Bulgarians coming in from the 1st of January. How much of an impact do you think that will have on the European elections that are coming up next year?
Oh, I think that it's going to be... I suspect that UKIP might actually win more votes than any other party at the European elections because relatively few people bother to go and vote. And the opinion survey seems to suggest that older people in particular are more sceptical about the EU and they might be tempted to go and vote. I actually think it's been a very positive thing, the way in which we've seen Poles come to Britain. I mean, what it's done for the construction trade and restaurants and so on has been quite remarkable. And I know somebody who's Romanian who's here at the moment, brought up in Italy. And again, she speaks better English than a lot of the people I come across up and down the country. And she can certainly write better than a lot of English people I come across. So I think that it's been a very positive thing on the whole to attract a lot of intelligent, go-ahead people from Eastern Europe. We could do with a few more of them, in my opinion.
Richard, I'm sure you'd agree with that.
All the economic evidence shows that immigration is a net positive for our economy, that immigrants pay more in taxes than they receive in benefits. There is an issue that comes up. It's not just about economics. There is an issue about culture and people feeling, is this the country they're used to? At what rate should things be allowed to change? There is an issue there. But on the economics, it's an overwhelmingly positive story. One thing in particular to say, mention about what's coming from beginning of next year with Romanians and Bulgarians. Romanians and Bulgarians already have the right to work here. What will happen is they'll be extended slightly from the beginning of next year. And in practice, right now, the Romanians and Bulgarians who want to come and work in Britain can do so. There's so this fear that's being stoked up that the entire country, those two countries, will be entirely depopulated. This is the
perhaps
demand.
That fear is slightly based on the fact that initial estimates of how many Poles would come here, for example, were wildly out.
Yeah, well, the next thing is that fewer Poles came to Britain than went to Germany.
Yes, but a lot more than they were expected.
No. And so the idea that every person in Romania and Bulgaria is waiting on the 1st of January 2014 to come to Britain and not to any of the other countries is just nonsense.
Well,
this is an important thing.
Out of a chance.
UKIP have nothing against immigrants. Matter of fact, some very fine people have come to this country. And if I were Romanian, or I were Bulgarian, or I were Polish, I would have been on the next boat out or the next train across, because I want to improve the lot of my family. And the European Union has completely destroyed the European economy with the euro. And so that's why there's massive unemployment in Greece, Portugal, Spain, and now that unemployment is being imported into the UK. I don't blame the Poles, I don't blame the Bulgarians coming over, I would do it myself. But the thing is, if you don't want the health service to collapse, if you want schools and hospitals, and you want the infrastructure to survive, it's impossible to have mass immigration on those levels.
You're listening to the Daily Debate on the Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing Britain's place in or out of Europe. I'm joined by David Coburn, UKIP's London chairman, Richard Lamming, Vice Chair of the European Movement UK, and by Keith Boyfield, an economist and research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Survey after survey shows that they pay more in taxes than they take out, immigrants.
Well, I'm not sure that that's always true. And if you're having mass immigration, you must remember that it's all very well for these fine gentlemen sitting next to me, tremendously middle class, very bourgeois, professional, all the rest of it. But what about the working man? What about the fact that his wages are being suppressed?
I don't think that's necessarily valid.
Shall we ask an economist, Keith?
It's very striking. Most of the European immigrants I come across seem to have 2 or 3 jobs, and none of them claim benefits. And it's very striking if you go to Scotland, for example. This is not just a London thing. My dear mother, who's about to celebrate her 94th birthday, is always struck when we go to some remote glen up in Scotland that you go to a hotel or bar, and it seems to be entirely populated by people from Estonia or Poland who speak extremely good English and are charming.
You speak as an economist, I speak as a businessman. Well, the reason for that is because the wages have been suppressed. They don't want those jobs because the wages are too low, because they're being undercut by European workers. Now, I don't blame the Poles. I don't blame any Eastern Europeans for coming here. I would do the same myself. Anyone would want to better their family. And no one is fighting to stay in France. No one is fighting to stay in Germany. They're all clambering over themselves to get to Calais, to come here. Because our social security system in this country is based on need. It is not based on how much you put in. On the continent, you only can take out what you've put in. That system does not apply in this country. Our social security system will collapse if you have unlimited open-door immigration. And the Bulgarian and Romanian people coming in may be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Now, I'm getting older, and I'd say you two chaps aren't quite in your first flush of youth. And, you might be sitting in a hospital queue. It's all right if it's getting your bunions scraped, but what happens if you've got cancer and you're sitting in a queue and you're sitting behind 200, 300 Bulgarians, Romanians? You've got to worry about that. I mean, I worry about that when I go to hospital. Can
I put your worries to Richard then? We're going to face a social security net that is under extreme pressure.
The doctors and the nurses are from the country. Without immigrants in this country, there would be no health service
because you don't train doctors and nurses, and you undercut their salaries. That's very simple. If you undercut their salaries, then British people don't want to do the jobs. Or they can't afford to do the jobs because they've got to feed their wives and families.
We're hearing from David the argument to put up the minimum wage.
What you want as a middle class person, as a bourgeois individual, you're just happy. As a bourgeois individual, you're as happy as Larry to see wages of working people suppressed, because it's not a threat to you. You're a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're an economist. So you're not under threat. Middle class people are not under threat. But what about the other people in this country? They have a say. They have a vote too.
I mean, Richard, there is evidence that wages at the low end of the scale are being depressed by the fact that immigration...
As Keith has said, no, that's just simply not what we find. That's not actually what we're finding. David is full of these awful, disgusting myths about... He says, I'm not attacking immigrants, and then proceeds to brutally criticise them at every turn.
Absolutely
I think
not.
David, you are stoking up a terrible, terrible atmosphere in this country of people suddenly fearing or hating foreigners, and I think that's not the Britain that I want to... I've grown up in. It's not the Britain that I want to live in. I think, David, you don't know anything about me. How can you say about all these accusations?
Can we get away from the personal side of this, please? It's not getting us anywhere. Can we ask some questions then perhaps about why Britain is so unpopular in Europe? We've got the figures here, say 9% of Germans and 50% of French people surveyed think of Britain as a positive influence. Richard, why do you think we are so low in this?
Well, we've just been listening to David. I think that's pretty good proof of that. If Britain sets out simply to be abusive to the other countries...
They're just being realistic about their economy. If we have unlimited open-door immigration from Europe, our health service and our social security system, which is different from the European system, will simply collapse. And that is not what the average Briton wants. As a matter of fact, UKIP has so many ethnic minorities, first and second generation. They are particularly worried about this. You have some of the older immigrant communities in this country cannot get jobs because of this. There are problems up in Sheffield. That's obviously concerning Mr. Clegg, who obviously doesn't go off to become a European Commissioner for his collaboration with Mr. Cameron. He's obviously want to re-elect in Sheffield, so he's just desperately worried about this. There's a lot of problems between the communities, Asian communities, and these Roma coming into this country who are not behaving in the same way that they would expect. So, there is a problem in this country. You can't just sweep it under the carpet. And it doesn't affect the middle classes as much as it affects the working classes.
I would say that it's rather significant that the advocates of ever greater political union over the last 20 years would have hoped that British school children would have been more interested to learn French, German, Italian and Spanish than they have proved to be. I think the statistics, and there was an OECD report on this recently, it's very discouraging the way in which, whereas even when you get sort of Italian, German footballers playing in the Premier League here, they all seem to speak pretty good English. Not that many English footballers speaking decent Italian or French overseas. Not too many of them go overseas.
Well, not too many British politicians either. David Cameron hasn't said a word of French since he came into office.
Despite his Eton education.
That's what the thing is. English is the world language. That's what's happening. That's why people from other countries can speak to each other in English. But it's not because they particularly want to speak to us. It's because they want to speak to each other. We have this fantasy.
It's discouraging that we don't want to speak to them in their native language, Italian or German.
Well, a historic failing of the British education system, though.
Well, I don't know. The
Scottish at least we're consistent.
But it's getting worse. Latin and Greek by the time I was 12, so I don't know about anybody else. But can I just say something very interesting? This Commissioner Anders from Hungary was criticising Britain and saying, Britain was going to be the nasty country. Well, this is great coming from a Hungarian where they have a party called Jobbik, which is a neo-fascist party which abuse ethnic minorities in Hungary.
But the chap might not be a member of that.
Can I just say,
he's an ex-communist. His party is an ex-communist party.
What David has just said is just quite disgusting. He's objecting to a Hungarian on the grounds that there is a racist political party in Hungary. Therefore, every Hungarian should shut up. David, that is just a really revolting way to conducting politics.
What I said was...
Treating people, you are of one nationality, therefore this is how you should behave.
What I said...
Sorry, we are out of time now, so on this rather fractious note, I'm going to have to leave it there. I'm Howell Davis, and I've been talking to David Coburn, UKIP's London chairman, Richard Lamming, Vice Chair of the European Movement UK, and Keith Boyfield of the Centre for Policy Studies. Thank you all very much. You must be very pleased by these figures. They do rather back up what you've been saying all along. Most Britons don't want to be in the EU.
Absolutely, and the more Mr. Salmond in Scotland keeps on about Scotland going into the European Union if it became independent, the more the Scots are disillusioned by the whole idea of it. I'm afraid that the vast majority of people in this country just simply are not interested in the European Union. They see it as an enormous money pit. It's undemocratic. The books haven't been audited for years. It's seen as thoroughly corrupt, and seen as a retirement home for corrupt European statesmen or prime ministers.
You're listening to The Daily Debate on The Voice of Russia. I'm Howell Davis, and today we're discussing Britain's place in or out of Europe. Last Sunday, the Observer newspaper published the results of a poll of 5,000 Europeans in 4 different countries: the UK, Germany, France and Poland. It showed Britons are far more hostile to the EU and its policies than people from the other 3 nations. Just 26% of voters here see the EU as a good thing, compared with 42% who see it. I'm joined now to discuss the significance of these latest figures by David Coburn, UKIP's London chairman, Richard Lamming, Vice Chair of the European Movement UK, a pro-European Union campaign group, and by Keith Boyfield, an economist and a research fellow at the think tank, the Centre for Policy Studies. If I might start with you, Richard, these are depressing figures for you, I would have thought.
These figures are consistent with what we've seen for a long time, which is in the face of a lot of bad news, some of it justified, but quite a lot of it, I have to say, not justified. People are getting disillusioned with the European Union. We can see that every day in lots of ways. It's much why it's important for those of us who understand that the European Union is a good thing and Britain's membership of it is a good thing, that we get organised to put the case, to explain the benefits to our daily lives from the fact that Britain's a member of the European Union and why we benefit from it so much and how much more we could get if we put even more into contribute even more to the European Union.
So what would you like Britain to contribute more of?
In lots of ways, encouraging free and open markets, for example. There's a great deal more the European Union could do to improve the markets in food and drink, for example, or in energy. There's a great deal of things that could be done there, which we British people would benefit from, people across the rest of Europe would benefit from. But if the British government champions this, we can find allies and we can promote these things across the whole of Europe for benefit of everyone.
David, of course, as a negative thing. And our European partners seemingly have little interest in keeping us in the Union. Just 9% of German and 15% of French people surveyed think Britain is a positive influence in the Union, though the number was higher for Poles, of whom 33% think the UK is a positive influence. The polling comes as senior political figures like Malcolm Rifkind and Nick Clegg say there's an urgent need to fight back against spiralling anti-EU sentiment. But they may have a tough fight on their hands. Polling this weekend shows that support for the vehemently anti-Europe UK Independence Party now stands at 19%, more than double that of the Liberal Democrats.